The Boeing 737 shuddered as it cut through the thick clouds over the Rocky Mountains, and Marcus Thompson's knuckles went white against his armrest. 37 years old, with graying temples that made him look older than his years, he closed his eyes and tried to push down the familiar surge of anxiety that air travel always brought him. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd flown over 200 combat missions in F-16s, now reduced to gripping his seat like a nervous first-time flyer. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some moderate turbulence as we make our approach into Denver. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Marcus opened his eyes and glanced around the cabin. Across the aisle, a young mother was trying to calm her crying toddler, bouncing him gently while whispering reassurances. Behind her, a businessman in an expensive suit continued typing on his laptop, seemingly unbothered by the aircraft's movements. In the seat next to Marcus, an elderly man clutched a rosary, his lips moving in silent prayer. The flight attendant, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, made her way down the aisle, checking that passengers were properly secured. When she reached Marcus's row, she paused. "Everything all right, sir?" she asked, noticing his tense posture. Marcus forced a smile. "Just fine, thanks." But he wasn't fine. Nothing had been fine for the 3 years since he'd returned from his final deployment in Afghanistan. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way his heart raced at unexpected sounds, it all felt like a betrayal of the confident pilot he'd once been. Colonel Marcus Steele Thompson, they'd called him. Steele because nothing could rattle him in the cockpit. Now he couldn't even handle a routine commercial flight without his hands shaking. The plane dropped suddenly, causing several passengers to gasp. Marcus's training kicked in automatically, his mind calculating wind shear patterns and atmospheric pressure, but his body remained rigid with tension. He'd been medically retired from the Air Force 18 months ago, his PTSD deemed too severe for active duty. The decision had felt like losing his identity entirely. As the aircraft stabilized, Marcus tried to focus on the reason for this trip. His sister Sarah lived in Denver now, and she'd been asking him to visit for months. "You need to get out of that apartment, Marcus," she'd said during their last phone call. "You're isolating yourself, and it's not healthy. Come stay with us for a few weeks. Help me with the kids, maybe look into some of those veteran programs I told you about." He'd finally agreed, more to stop her worried calls than out of any real desire to change his situation. But now, suspended 30,000 feet above the Colorado landscape, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. The walls of his small apartment in Phoenix suddenly seemed appealing, familiar, controlled, safe. The plane banked left, beginning its descent, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the Denver skyline through his window. The city sprawled beneath them like a circuit board, all geometric patterns and glinting surfaces. For a moment, the view reminded him of the countless approaches he'd made to air bases around the world, and something stirred in his chest. Not anxiety this time, but a ghost of the old excitement he used to feel when flying. "We'll be landing in Denver in approximately 15 minutes, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Flight attendants, please prepare for landing." Marcus watched the flight attendant. Her name tag read Janet, as she moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. There was something about her demeanor that reminded him of the crew chiefs he'd worked with overseas, that quiet competence born of experience. She caught him watching and smiled warmly. "First time to Denver?" she asked. "No, ma'am. First time in a while, though." "Well, it's beautiful this time of year. The aspens are just starting to turn." She paused, studying his face with the intuition that comes from years of reading passengers. "Military?" Marcus nodded, unsure why he'd admitted it. "My son's army," Janet said quietly. "2 tours in Iraq. I know that look." Before Marcus could respond, she'd moved on, continuing her pre-landing checks, but her words stayed with him as the plane descended through the clouds. That look. He'd caught glimpses of it in mirrors, seen it in the faces of other veterans at the VA hospital. It was the look of someone carrying invisible weight, of experiences that couldn't be shared with those who hadn't lived them. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical thunk that made Marcus's shoulders tense, but the touchdown was smooth. As they taxied toward the gate, he felt the familiar mix of relief and disappointment that came with each successful flight. Relief that nothing had gone wrong, disappointment in himself for being afraid in the first place. Denver International Airport buzzed with activity as Marcus made his way through the terminal. The familiar chaos of travelers rushing to catch connections, the constant announcements echoing overhead, and the scent of coffee and fast food created a sensory overload that made him pause and take a steadying breath. His carry-on bag felt heavier than it should, and he realized his shoulders were still rigid from the flight. Sarah would be waiting at baggage claim, probably with her 2 kids in tow. He hadn't seen his nephew Jake and niece Emma in over a year, and the thought of their enthusiastic greetings filled him with both warmth and anxiety. Children had a way of asking direct questions that adults learned to avoid, and he wasn't sure he was ready for, "Uncle Marcus, why don't you fly planes anymore?" As he walked past a group of uniformed soldiers heading home on leave, one of them nodded in recognition. That subtle acknowledgement that passed between veterans. Marcus nodded back, feeling the familiar mix of brotherhood and separation that defined his relationship with his military past. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Flight delayed 30 minutes. Kids are driving me crazy. Can't wait to see you." Marcus smiled despite himself. Sarah had always been the optimist in the family, seeing possibilities where he saw obstacles. Even after their parents died in a car accident 10 years ago, she'd been the one holding them together, making sure he ate during leave, sending care packages overseas. Now she was trying to hold him together again, though he wasn't sure he was worth the effort. He found a quiet spot near the windows overlooking the tarmac and watched the ground crews servicing aircraft. The choreographed dance of fuel trucks, baggage carts, and maintenance personnel was something he'd observed thousands of times from the cockpit, but seeing it from this perspective felt different. He was on the outside now, looking in at a world that had once defined him. A commotion near the departure gate caught his attention. Passengers were gathering around the desk, their voices rising in concern. Marcus couldn't hear the details, but he recognized the body language of people receiving bad news about their travel plans. He'd seen it often enough during his own commercial flights over the past 3 years. "Attention passengers on Flight 847 to Chicago," came an announcement over the gate speaker system. "We're experiencing a mechanical issue and need to delay boarding while our maintenance team conducts an inspection. We'll provide updates as soon as possible." Groans and complaints rippled through the crowd. Marcus felt a pang of sympathy for the gate agents, who would spend the next few hours dealing with frustrated travelers and rebooking requests. He remembered the stress of flight operations, though from a very different perspective. His phone rang. Sarah again. "Hey, where are you? I'm at baggage claim, but I don't see you. My flight got in on time, but I'm waiting for something. I'll be there in a few minutes. Everything okay? You sound tense." Marcus paused, watching as several passengers argued with the gate agent about hotel vouchers. "Just airport drama, nothing I can't handle." "Okay, but Marcus, don't feel like you have to handle everything alone anymore, all right? That's what family is for." After hanging up, he shouldered his bag and headed toward baggage claim. The walk took him past the delayed flights gate, where he overheard fragments of conversation from the gate agents huddled behind the desk. "Captain called in sick at the last minute. Replacement pilot is stuck in Dallas. Might have to cancel the entire flight." Marcus kept walking, but something nagged at him. Cancelled flights meant stranded passengers, missed connections, disrupted plans. For some people, it might mean missing a funeral, a wedding, or a critical business meeting. He'd learned during his military service that sometimes small actions had large consequences, and sometimes the right person in the right place could make all the difference. But that wasn't his problem anymore. He wasn't responsible for fixing things, wasn't the go-to guy for impossible situations. Those days were behind him, along with the pressure, the responsibility, and the weight of other people's lives in his hands. As he reached the baggage claim area, he spotted Sarah immediately. At 34, she looked remarkably like their mother had at that age, with the same warm brown eyes and expressive hands that gestured constantly when she spoke. 10-year-old Jake and 8-year-old Emma flanked her, both bouncing with barely contained energy. "Uncle Marcus," Emma launched herself at him with the fearless enthusiasm that only children possessed. Jake, trying to be more mature, settled for a grin and a firm handshake. "Look at you two," Marcus said, accepting Emma's hug and ruffling Jake's hair. "You've both grown a foot since I saw you last." "Mom says you're going to stay with us for a while," Jake said. "Are you going to teach me to fly?" The question hit him like a physical blow, but Marcus managed to keep his expression neutral. "We'll see, buddy. Maybe we can build some model planes instead." Sarah caught his eye over the children's heads, her expression apologetic. They'd talked about this, about not putting pressure on him to discuss his flying days. But kids were kids, and Jake had been fascinated by airplanes since he was old enough to point at the sky. How about we get some ice cream on the way home? Sarah suggested, smoothly redirecting the conversation. I know a place that has those flavors you like, Marcus. As they waited for his luggage, Marcus found himself thinking about the stranded passengers upstairs. Somewhere in that crowd were people whose plans were falling apart, who were probably calling loved ones to explain why they wouldn't be home tonight. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of the world's problems, but for those individuals, it felt enormous. He shook his head, focusing on his nephew's chatter about school and soccer. This was why he was here, to reconnect with family, to remember what life was like outside the narrow world of his apartment and his memories. Whatever was happening with that delayed flight wasn't his concern. He'd done his part for his country. Now it was time to figure out how to do his part for himself. The ice cream shop Sarah had promised turned out to be a small family-owned place called Rocky Mountain Scoops, tucked between a bookstore and a coffee shop in a strip mall 20 minutes from the airport. The kids had chocolate smeared on their faces within minutes, and Marcus found himself genuinely smiling for the first time in weeks as Emma told him an elaborate story about her pet hamster's escape attempts. So Whiskers figured out how to open the cage latch, she explained, gesturing wildly with her spoon, and Mom found him in the kitchen at midnight, eating crackers from the counter. That hamster is too smart for his own good, Sarah laughed, wiping chocolate from Emma's chin. Just like someone else I know. Marcus was starting to relax, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders, when Sarah's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It's Tom, she said, referring to her husband. He's supposed to be at work. This is weird. She answered on the third ring. Hey, what's up? Marcus watched his sister's expression change as she listened, her eyebrows drawing together in concern. What do you mean emergency landing? Which flight? There was a pause. Oh my God. Are you serious? She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide. Okay, I'm putting you on speaker. Marcus needs to hear this. Tom's voice crackled through the phone's speaker, tension evident even through the small device. Marcus, thank God Sarah was picking you up today. There's a situation at DIA. Flight 847 to Chicago, the one that was delayed earlier. They finally got a replacement crew and took off about an hour ago. Marcus felt his stomach drop. What happened? The captain had some kind of medical emergency 20 minutes into the flight. Heart attack, maybe a stroke. They're not sure yet. The first officer is trying to handle it alone, but he's only got about 300 hours of flight time. Most of that is in smaller aircraft. Sarah grabbed Marcus's hand. Is the plane in danger? They're declaring an emergency and trying to get back to Denver, but Tom's voice trailed off. Marcus, they're asking for any available pilots to come to the airport. Commercial, military, anyone with heavy aircraft experience. The tower is coordinating, but they need all the help they can get. The ice cream shop suddenly felt too small, too warm. Marcus could hear his heart pounding in his ears, the familiar sound that preceded every combat mission he'd ever flown. But this wasn't combat, this was worse. This was civilians, innocent people who'd trusted their lives to a system that was failing them. How many passengers? He heard himself ask. 137 passengers, plus crew. Emma looked back and forth between the adults, sensing the tension but not understanding it. Jake, older and more perceptive, had stopped eating his ice cream entirely. Marcus? Sarah's voice was soft, but he could hear the question in it. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need to get to the airport. Uncle Marcus, what's wrong? Emma asked, her voice small. Sarah knelt down next to her daughter. There are some people who need help, sweetheart. Uncle Marcus might be able to help them. But you said he doesn't fly anymore, Jake said, confusion clear in his voice. Marcus looked at his nephew, seeing something of himself in the boy's serious expression. Sometimes, he said carefully, people have to do things they're not sure they can do, because it's the right thing to do. I'll drive you, Sarah said, already gathering her purse and the kids' jackets. Sarah, no. Take the kids home. This isn't... Don't even try to argue with me, Marcus Thompson. Those people need help and you're going to help them. We're all going. The drive back to the airport passed in a blur of radio updates and phone calls. Tom, who worked for the Denver Fire Department, had connections throughout the city's emergency services and was feeding them information as it became available. They've got emergency vehicles staged on both runways, he reported during one call. The first officer is maintaining altitude and heading, but he's requesting priority handling for the approach. Marcus stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar landmarks blur past. His hands were shaking, not with fear this time, but with something else. Adrenaline, maybe, or purpose. He hadn't felt anything like it since his last mission 3 years ago. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, not taking her eyes off the road, "you don't have to do this. You know that, right? No one would blame you if you—" "Yes, they would," he interrupted. "I would." She glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've spent 3 years running away from who I used to be, telling myself I was broken, that I couldn't handle the responsibility anymore." He watched a commercial airliner pass overhead, heading toward DIA. "But those people up there don't care about my problems. They just need someone who knows what they're doing." "And you do know what you're doing." It wasn't a question, but Marcus answered anyway. "I used to." Denver International Airport's Emergency Operations Center was controlled chaos when they arrived. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police vehicles were positioned at strategic points around the terminal, their red and blue lights creating an urgent strobe effect in the late afternoon light. Sarah had to park in a remote lot after being turned away from the main terminal entrance twice. "Stay close," Marcus told the kids as they hurried toward the terminal. The normally busy sidewalks were crowded with airport personnel, emergency responders, and media crews who'd gotten wind of the developing story. Inside the terminal, Marcus approached the information desk, where a stressed-looking airline employee was fielding questions from concerned passengers and reporters. "Excuse me," he said, showing his military ID. "Colonel Marcus Thompson, retired Air Force. I understand you're looking for pilots." The woman's eyes widened with relief. "Yes, sir, please follow me. They've set up a command post near Gate B-15. As they made their way through the terminal, Marcus could feel his training taking over. His situational awareness heightened, his mind automatically cataloging resources, personnel, and potential obstacles. It was like putting on a familiar piece of clothing after years in civilian dress. The command post was a hive of activity. FAA officials huddled around laptops displaying radar tracks. Airline executives spoke in urgent whispers into their phones, and airport security personnel monitored radio traffic. At the center of it all stood Captain Jennifer Walsh, a tall woman with graying brown hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions. "Captain Walsh?" Marcus approached her, his military bearing automatically asserting itself. "Colonel Marcus Thompson, retired Air Force. I understand you need pilots." She looked up from a weather report, her expression shifting from stressed to hopeful. "Colonel, what's your experience with commercial aircraft?" "F-16s primarily, but I've got simulator time in Boeing and Airbus platforms, about 4,000 hours total flight time, including combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan." "Combat operations," she repeated, and something in her expression told him that detail mattered. "Good. We need someone who can work under pressure. The situation is this. Flight 847, Boeing 737-800, is about 40 minutes out. The captain is unconscious. We think it's a heart attack. The first officer, David Chen, is a good kid, but he's green. 300 hours total, most of that in regional aircraft." Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the implications. "What's the weather like?" "Marginal. Winds gusting to 25 knots, scattered clouds at 1,500 feet. Not terrible, but not great for someone who's never handled an approach in conditions like this with a fully loaded aircraft. What do you need me to do?" Captain Walsh gestured toward a radio setup. "Right now, we need you to talk to Chen. Help him stay calm, walk him through the approach procedures. We've got ground support coordinating, but we need someone who understands what he's dealing with up there." Marcus looked back at his family. Sarah had found seats for the kids near a window where they could watch the activity outside, but her eyes were fixed on him with a mixture of pride and worry. "Sarah," he called, and she came over immediately. "This might take a while. Are you okay waiting?" "Marcus, we're not going anywhere. Those people need you." She squeezed his arm. "You've got this." Captain Walsh handed him a headset. "Flight 847, this is Denver Ground Control. We have Colonel Thompson here to assist. He's military, with extensive flight experience." The response came through immediately, the young pilot's voice tight with stress. "Denver Ground, this is Flight 847. First Officer Chen speaking. We've got the captain stabilized, but he's still unconscious. I'm maintaining altitude at flight level 350 following your vectors, but I could really use some help here." Marcus took the headset, his voice automatically shifting into the calm, authoritative tone he'd used hundreds of times in combat situations. David, this is Colonel Thompson. I'm here to help you get everyone home safely. First, I need you to take a deep breath and tell me about your aircraft's condition. Yes, sir. All systems are showing green. Fuel is good for another hour and a half. Passengers are scared but cooperative. Flight attendants are keeping them calm. Outstanding. David, I want you to know that you're doing everything right. A 737 is a forgiving aircraft and you've got excellent weather for the approach. Have you ever flown an ILS approach in a 737 simulator? Yes, sir. Several times during training. Good. This is going to be just like those simulator sessions, except it's going to go perfectly because you know what you're doing, and I'm going to be right here talking you through every step. As Marcus began coordinating with the young first officer, something shifted inside him. The anxiety and self-doubt that had plagued him for 3 years began to fade, replaced by the focused clarity that had made him an exceptional combat pilot. This was what he'd been trained for. Not this exact scenario, but this type of high-stakes problem-solving under pressure. From the corner of his eye, he could see Jake watching him intently, and Marcus realized that his nephew was seeing him as he truly was for the first time, not the broken veteran who'd been hiding in his apartment, but the officer who'd earned his call sign Steel through competence, courage, and an absolute refusal to give up when lives were on the line. "Flight 847, Marcus said into the radio. "Let's bring you home." "Flight 847, I need you to begin your descent to flight level 280, Marcus said into the headset, his voice steady and controlled. Around him the command post had grown quieter, as everyone focused on the radio conversation that would determine the fate of 137 passengers. "Roger, Denver ground. Beginning descent to flight level 280, came First Officer Chen's response. There was still tension in his voice, but Marcus could hear him gaining confidence with each successful instruction. Captain Walsh appeared at Marcus's shoulder with a weather update. "Winds are picking up," she said quietly. "Gusting to 30 knots now, and there's a line of storms moving in from the west. We need to get them down in the next 20 minutes, or we'll have to divert to Colorado Springs." Marcus nodded, his mind rapidly calculating approach speeds, descent rates, and timing. "David, I'm going to walk you through the approach setup now. I need you to dial in the ILS frequency for runway 34 right. That's 111.9. 111.9, Roger. Setting now. Good. Your decision altitude will be 5,431 feet. Cross the outer marker at 6,000 feet and maintain approach speed of 140 knots until you're established on the glide slope." Sarah had moved closer, standing where Marcus could see her in his peripheral vision. Her presence was anchoring, a reminder of why he was doing this, not just for the strangers on the airplane, but for the family that had never stopped believing in him. "Colonel Thompson," came Chen's voice through the static. "I'm showing some turbulence ahead. Should I request a different altitude?" Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, visualizing the approach. He'd landed in much worse conditions in combat zones, with surface-to-air missiles tracking his aircraft and enemy fire lighting up the night sky. This was challenging, but manageable. "Negative, David. That turbulence is normal for this altitude and conditions. Keep your airspeed steady and don't fight the aircraft. Let it ride the bumps and focus on maintaining your heading and descent rate." "Roger that," an FAA official approached with a clipboard. "Colonel, we've got emergency equipment positioned on both sides of the runway. Medical teams are standing by for the captain, and we've cleared all other traffic from the airspace." "What about passenger preparation?" Marcus asked. "Flight attendants are briefing everyone on emergency procedures," Captain Walsh replied. "But honestly, if this goes according to plan, the passengers won't even know how serious this was." Marcus keyed the radio again. "Flight 847, how's your captain doing?" "Still unconscious, but the flight attendant who's monitoring him says his breathing is stable. She used to be a nurse." "Excellent. David, I need you to start configuring for approach. Lower your landing gear and set flaps to 15 degrees. Lowering gear down and locked, flaps 15. Through the terminal windows, Marcus could see the first signs of the approaching storm. Dark clouds building on the western horizon, and the windsocks at the airport beginning to dance more aggressively. Time was running short. "Flight 847, you're 20 miles out. Contact Denver Tower on 120.3 for final approach clearance. Switching to tower frequency now. And Colonel, thank you for being there." Marcus felt something tight in his chest loosen. "David, you're doing the hard part. I'm just along for the ride." As the young pilot switched frequencies, Captain Walsh put her hand on Marcus's shoulder. "That was well done, Colonel. You may have just saved 137 lives." "We're not down yet," Marcus replied, but for the first time in years, he felt truly useful. Not broken, not damaged, but exactly where he was supposed to be. The next 15 minutes stretched like hours. Marcus had moved to the tower frequency as well, maintaining communication with First Officer Chen as he guided Flight 847 through its final approach to runway 34 right. The storm clouds were closer now, and the first drops of rain were beginning to streak the terminal windows. "Flight 847, you're 5 miles out, on course and on glide path," the tower controller announced. "Emergency vehicles are in position." Marcus watched through the windows as the Boeing 737 appeared through the clouds, its landing lights cutting through the gathering dusk and rain. From this distance it looked stable and controlled, but he knew that appearances could be deceiving. The real test would come in the next few minutes. "David, how are you feeling?" Marcus asked into the radio. "Honestly, scared as hell, but ready to get these people on the ground. That's the right attitude. Remember, you've done this approach 100 times in the simulator. This is no different, except today you get to be the hero." Jake had moved to stand next to his uncle, pressing his face against the window to watch the approaching aircraft. "Is that the plane in trouble, Uncle Marcus?" "That's the one, buddy. The pilot is really young?" Marcus looked down at his nephew, seeing genuine concern in the boy's eyes. "About the same age you'll be when you finish college. But you know what? Age doesn't matter as much as training and having good people to help you. Like you're helping him? Exactly like that." On the radio, the tower controller's voice cut through the static. "Flight 847, winds are 340 at 28, gusting to 35. You're cleared to land runway 34 right." "Cleared to land 34 right," Chen responded, his voice tight with concentration. Marcus keyed his radio. "David, those are strong winds, but they're almost straight down the runway. Use the crab technique. Angle the aircraft into the wind to maintain your center line, then straighten out just before touchdown." "Roger, crabbing for wind correction." Through the window, Marcus could see the aircraft adjusting its approach angle, the nose pointing slightly left of the runway center line to compensate for the crosswind. It was a textbook maneuver, executed with precision. "Looking good, Flight 847. Maintain current approach speed." Sarah appeared at Marcus's other side, slipping her hand into his. "He's going to make it, isn't he?" "Yeah," Marcus said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "He's going to make it." The 737 was less than a mile out now, its landing gear extended like the legs of a giant bird preparing to touch down. Marcus could see the aircraft fighting the crosswind, making small corrections to maintain its approach path. "Flight 847, you're looking perfect. Half a mile out on speed and on glide path." "Thank you, Colonel. I can see the runway." The tension in the command post was palpable. Every person present, airline executives, FAA officials, emergency responders, stood transfixed as they watched the drama unfold. This was the moment when training, experience, and courage would either triumph or fail. "Quarter mile, Flight 847. Start your flare in 5 seconds. Now." Marcus watched as the aircraft's nose lifted slightly, bleeding off the last of its airspeed as it prepared to touch down. The crosswind caught it at the last second, pushing the aircraft slightly right of centerline, but Chen corrected smoothly. "Easy, David. Let it settle." The main landing gear touched the runway with a puff of smoke from the tires, followed immediately by the nose gear. The aircraft rolled straight down the centerline, and Marcus could hear the reverse thrust engaging as Chen worked to slow the heavy jet. "Flight 847, welcome to Denver. Taxi clear of the runway and follow the emergency vehicles to the gate." A cheer went up in the command post, and Marcus found himself grinning broadly for the first time in months. Around him, people were shaking hands, hugging, and calling their supervisors with the good news, but his attention was focused on the radio, where Chen's voice came through one last time. "Denver ground, Flight 847 is safely on deck, requesting medical personnel for the captain. Medical personnel is standing by, Flight 847, and David, that was one hell of a landing." Marcus pulled off his headset and turned to find his entire family watching him with expressions of amazement and pride. Emma rushed forward and hugged his waist, while Jake stood a little straighter, as if seeing his uncle in a completely new light. "You did it," Sarah said, her eyes bright with tears. "You really did it." "We all did it," Marcus replied, but he knew what she meant. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he had faced a crisis head-on and succeeded. Not just succeeded, he had been exactly the person the situation demanded. Captain Walsh approached with her hand extended. "Colonel, I don't know how to thank you. That young man would never have been able to handle that approach alone, especially with the weather deteriorating like it did." Marcus shook her hand, feeling a sense of completion that had been absent from his life for years. "Captain, I should be thanking you. You gave me the chance to remember who I used to be." "Who you still are," she corrected. "The question is, what do you plan to do with that knowledge?" As Marcus looked out at the 737 being surrounded by emergency vehicles and ground crews, he realized he didn't have an answer to that question yet. But for the first time in 3 years, he was looking forward to finding out. The media attention started within hours. By the time Marcus and his family made it back to Sarah's house in the suburbs, news vans were already parked on the street, and his phone hadn't stopped ringing. The story had all the elements that captured public imagination. A mysterious veteran stepping forward in a crisis, a young pilot facing impossible odds, and 137 lives hanging in the balance. "Uncle Marcus, you're on TV!" Emma shouted from the living room, where the local news was running footage of Flight 847's landing on repeat. Marcus winced as he saw his own image flash on the screen, a still photo from his military service file that someone had managed to dig up. In it, he looked confident and composed, every inch the decorated combat pilot. It felt like looking at a stranger. Colonel Marcus Steele Thompson, a decorated Air Force veteran with over 200 combat missions, emerged from retirement yesterday to help guide a troubled commercial airliner to safety, the news anchor was saying. Sources at Denver International Airport confirmed that without Thompson's intervention, the outcome could have been very different. Sarah muted the television and turned to her brother, who was standing in the doorway looking deeply uncomfortable. "Marcus, you need to see this as what it is, recognition for something genuinely heroic." "I didn't do anything heroic," he protested. "I just talked a good pilot through a procedure he already knew. Chen did all the real work." "Mum, why doesn't Uncle Marcus want to be on TV?" Jake asked, looking confused. "At school, when kids do something good, they get awards and stuff." Marcus sat down on the couch next to his nephew, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes, Jake, people pay attention to the wrong things. What happened today wasn't about me being special. It was about everyone working together. The pilot, the air traffic controllers, the emergency crews. I just happened to be the guy with the radio." Tom, who had arrived home from work an hour earlier, looked up from his laptop where he'd been monitoring news coverage. "The Denver Post wants to interview you tomorrow. So do CNN, Fox News, and about 6 other outlets. And there's already talk about some kind of civilian commendation from the mayor." The thought of interviews and ceremonies made Marcus's chest tighten. "I'm not doing interviews." "Marcus," Sarah said gently, "people are inspired by this story. Maybe you should consider—" "No." His voice was sharper than he'd intended, and he saw Emma flinch slightly. He softened his tone. "I'm sorry, but no. This isn't about me, and I don't want it to become about me." His phone rang again, the 4th time in 10 minutes. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, probably another reporter. He let it go to voicemail, just like the dozen others he'd received. "You know," Tom said thoughtfully, "there might be another way to handle this. What if you focused the attention on something productive, like veteran support programs or aviation safety, or helping other former military pilots transition to civilian careers?" Marcus looked at his brother-in-law with new respect. Tom was a firefighter, someone who understood the difference between doing your job and seeking glory for it. "What do you mean?" "I mean, people are going to tell this story whether you participate or not. But if you do participate, you get to control the message. You could talk about the challenges veterans face coming home, or the importance of supporting young pilots, or whatever matters to you." Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock at the front door. Sarah peered through the peephole and frowned. "It's not a reporter, looks like airline personnel." She opened the door to reveal Captain Walsh, now in civilian clothes, accompanied by a young Asian man Marcus didn't immediately recognize. "Captain Walsh," Marcus said, standing up. "I wasn't expecting to see you again." "I hope you don't mind us dropping by," she said. "I wanted you to meet someone." She gestured to the young man beside her. "This is David Chen." Marcus felt his breath catch. The young pilot looked different on the ground, smaller somehow, more fragile than the confident voice that had come through the radio, but his handshake was firm, and his eyes were clear and grateful. "Colonel Thompson," Chen said, "I wanted to thank you in person. What you did today, I couldn't have landed that plane without you." "David, you absolutely could have. And you did. I just helped you stay calm." "No, sir. With respect, it was more than that." Chen's voice was earnest, almost urgent. "When I first heard we had an emergency, I thought about all the things that could go wrong. But when you came on the radio, suddenly I was thinking about all the things I could do right. That made all the difference." Emma, who had been watching the conversation with wide eyes, suddenly spoke up. "Are you the pilot who landed the airplane?" Chen smiled and knelt down to her level. "I am. And your uncle is the reason everyone got home safe today." "He's really good at helping people," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Mom says he used to help people all the time when he was in the Air Force." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't realized was there. For 3 years he'd focused on everything he'd lost. His career, his confidence, his sense of purpose. But maybe Emma was right. Maybe helping people wasn't something he used to do. Maybe it was something he still did, when it mattered most. The next morning brought a surprise that changed everything. Marcus was drinking coffee in Sarah's kitchen, trying to work up the courage to check his voicemail, when Captain Walsh called directly. "Colonel, I know you said you weren't interested in publicity, but I have something different to propose. Can we meet for coffee? There's someone I'd like you to talk to." An hour later, Marcus found himself in a downtown Denver cafe, sitting across from Captain Walsh and a distinguished-looking man in his 60s who introduced himself as Robert Martinez, Director of Flight Training for Frontier Airlines. "Colonel Thompson," Martinez began, "Jennifer has told me about your performance yesterday, and I've reviewed your military record. I have a proposition for you." Marcus felt his guard go up immediately. "If this is about some kind of publicity stunt—" "It's not," Martinez interrupted gently. "It's about a job. We're launching a new program to help military pilots transition to commercial aviation. We need someone to run it, someone who understands both worlds, military and civilian, and who has the credibility to reach veterans who might be struggling with the transition." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "I'm medically retired. PTSD. I can't fly commercially." "I'm not asking you to fly the line," Martinez replied. "I'm asking you to teach. Simulator instruction, mentorship, helping former military pilots navigate the certification process and the cultural adjustment. Yesterday, you proved you still have all the technical knowledge and leadership skills that made you an exceptional military pilot." Captain Walsh leaned forward. "Marcus, I've been flying for 23 years, and I've seen a lot of emergency situations. What you did yesterday wasn't just good radio work. You took command of that situation in a way that inspired confidence in everyone involved. The pilot, the controllers, the emergency crews. That's not a skill you lose." "I haven't been in a cockpit in 3 years," Marcus said, but he could hear the doubt in his own voice. "Neither had most of our students when they started," Martinez replied. "The difference is, you'd be the one helping them overcome that fear, that sense of disconnection. You'd be the proof that there's life after military service, that the skills and experience they gained don't have to be wasted." Marcus stared into his coffee, his mind racing. The idea was tempting, but it also terrified him. What if he had another panic attack? What if his PTSD symptoms returned in a high-stress teaching environment? "I'd need time to think about it," he said finally. "Of course. But Marcus, let me ask you something. How did you feel yesterday when you were talking to David?" The answer came without hesitation. "Like myself again. That's what I thought." Martinez pulled out a business card. "Take all the time you need. But consider this. Yesterday, you saved 137 lives by doing what you do best, teaching someone else to be better than they thought they could be. Imagine doing that every day, with veterans who need exactly the kind of guidance you can provide." After Martinez and Captain Walsh left, Marcus sat alone in the cafe for another hour, watching the Denver morning rush unfold outside the windows. His phone buzzed with another reporter's call, but for once, he didn't feel the familiar spike of anxiety. Instead, he found himself thinking about David Chen's words. "When you came on the radio, suddenly I was thinking about all the things I could do right." Maybe that was what he'd been missing for the past 3 years. Not the flying itself, but the sense of purpose that came from helping others succeed. The knowledge that his experience, his skills, and even his struggles could be valuable to someone else. When he finally called Sarah, his voice was steadier than it had been in months. "How would you feel about having a house guest for a while longer?" he asked. "Marcus, you can stay as long as you want, you know that. But why? What's changed?" "I think I might have found something worth doing again." That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Jake asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Uncle Marcus, are you going to be a pilot again?" Marcus looked around the table at the faces of the people who had never stopped believing in him, even when he'd stopped believing in himself. "Not exactly, buddy, but I might teach other people to be pilots. People who need someone to help them remember what they're capable of. Like you helped that pilot yesterday." Exactly like that. Emma, who had been quietly coloring during the conversation, looked up suddenly. "Uncle Marcus, do you feel better now?" It was such a simple question, but it cut straight to the heart of everything. Marcus realized that for the first time in 3 years, the answer was genuinely yes. Not completely healed. He knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but better, hopeful, ready to try. "Yeah, Emma, I think I do feel better." As thunder rumbled outside and rain began to patter against the windows, Marcus felt a sense of peace settle over him. The storm had passed, both literally and figuratively. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the hard work of rebuilding a life around purpose instead of just survival. But tonight, for the first time in years, he was looking forward to finding out what came next. 3 months later, Marcus stood in front of Frontier Airlines' state-of-the-art flight training facility, watching his first class of veteran pilots file into the briefing room. 8 men and women, ages ranging from 28 to 45, all carrying the same mix of hope and uncertainty he'd felt when he first walked into this building. The Wings Forward program had launched to significant fanfare, partly due to the media attention from the Flight 847 incident that Marcus had finally reluctantly embraced. But more importantly, it had launched because there was a genuine need. Hundreds of military pilots left service every year, many struggling to translate their skills into civilian aviation careers. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority he'd thought he'd lost forever. "I'm Marcus Thompson, and for the next 6 weeks we're going to work together to get you ready for commercial aviation careers." He looked around the room, recognizing himself in their faces. Staff Sergeant Monica Rodriguez, an Apache helicopter pilot with 3 Afghanistan tours, Captain James Park, an F-18 pilot who'd been medically retired after an ejection seat injury, Master Sergeant Kevin Williams, a transport pilot whose wife had given him an ultimatum: find a way to keep flying or find a new marriage. "Before we talk about systems or procedures," Marcus continued, "I want to address something that probably every one of you is thinking about right now. You're wondering if you still have what it takes. You're questioning whether civilian flying will feel the same as military flying. And some of you are probably dealing with the same thing I dealt with, the fear that you're broken somehow, that the experiences you've had have made you unfit for normal life." The room was completely silent. Monica Rodriguez shifted in her seat, her jaw tight with recognition. 3 months ago, I was having panic attacks on commercial flights. I hadn't been in a cockpit since my medical retirement, and I was convinced my flying days were over. Then I found myself talking a young pilot through an emergency landing, and I remembered something important. Our training doesn't disappear. Our judgment doesn't evaporate. The experiences that seem like baggage are actually tools. Captain Park raised his hand. "Sir, how do you deal with the adjustment? I mean, commercial flying seems so different from what we're used to." Marcus nodded, remembering asking the same question. "It is different, James. In the military, every flight was a mission. Lives depended on our performance, and the stakes felt enormous. Commercial flying can seem mundane in comparison. But here's what I've learned. Civilian passengers trust us with the same thing military personnel did: their lives. The mission is different, but the responsibility is exactly the same." The morning session covered basic commercial aviation regulations and procedures, but Marcus kept the focus on the human element. During the lunch break, Monica Rodriguez approached him. "Colonel Thompson, can I ask you something personal?" "Marcus? And yes? Do the nightmares go away? I mean, I'm functional during the day, but at night—" She trailed off, looking embarrassed. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it wasn't anxiety. It was recognition. They get better. They don't disappear, but they get better. And having a sense of purpose again, having a reason to get up in the morning that's bigger than just surviving, That helps more than anything else. Is that what this is for you? Purpose? Marcus looked around the training facility, at the simulators and classrooms where he'd been spending his days for the past month, preparing for this moment. Yeah, I think it is. That afternoon, he took the class into the Boeing 737 simulator for their first hands-on training. As he watched Monica Rodriguez work through an approach procedure, calling out altitudes and airspeeds with precision, he felt the same satisfaction he'd experienced talking to David Chen 3 months earlier. Nice work, Monica. Your scan pattern is excellent and your communication is clear and concise. She looked up from the controls, a slight smile breaking through her usual serious expression. Thank you, sir. This feels right. It should. You're good at this. As the day ended and the students filed out, chatting among themselves with the beginning of camaraderie, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted in his life. For 3 years, he'd defined himself by what he'd lost. Now, he was beginning to see himself in terms of what he could give. 6 months after the Flight 847 incident, Marcus found himself back at Denver International Airport, but this time as a passenger on a routine flight to Phoenix. Sarah had finally convinced him to clean out his old apartment and officially make Colorado his permanent home. As he settled into his seat, he felt none of the old anxiety. The familiar sounds of engines spooling up, the gentle acceleration down the runway, the moment of liftoff, it all felt natural again, like coming home after a long absence. The flight attendant, a young man named Brandon, stopped by his seat during the service. "Excuse me, are you Marcus Thompson, the pilot who helped with that emergency landing last year?" Marcus nodded, no longer uncomfortable with the recognition. "That's me. My sister was on that flight. She still talks about how calm everyone stayed because of what you did. I just wanted to say thank you. Your sister and the other passengers stayed calm because they trusted the crew, and because the pilot did an outstanding job under pressure. Maybe, but she said everyone could hear you on the intercom, talking that young pilot through everything. She said you sounded like someone who knew exactly what to do." After Brandon moved on, Marcus looked out the window at the landscape passing below. The Wings Forward program had graduated its first class the week before, and all 8 students had received job offers from various airlines. Monica Rodriguez would be starting with Southwest Airlines next month. James Park had accepted a position with United. Kevin Williams had managed to save his marriage and his flying career simultaneously. But more importantly, Marcus had discovered that teaching these veterans wasn't just about helping them transition to civilian careers. It was about creating a community of people who understood each other's experiences, who could support each other through the challenges that came with military service and the difficulties of finding new purpose afterward. His phone buzzed with a text from David Chen, who had become a regular correspondent. "Marcus, just wanted to let you know I passed my captain upgrade training. First flight as pilot in command is next Tuesday. Still think about that day we met and how you helped me believe I could do it. Thank you for everything." Marcus smiled, typing back, "Congratulations, Captain Chen. Fly safe, and remember, trust your training." The response came immediately. "Always do. And Marcus, I hope you know that you saved more than just one airplane that day. You saved me from doubting myself." As the flight continued toward Phoenix, Marcus thought about the conversation he'd had with Sarah the night before. She'd asked him if he was happy, and for the first time in years he'd been able to answer without hesitation, yes. Not because his PTSD had magically disappeared. He still had difficult days, still struggled with memories and anxiety, but because he'd learned that healing wasn't about becoming who he used to be. It was about becoming someone new, someone who could take the experiences that had nearly broken him and transform them into tools for helping others. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Phoenix. Weather is clear, and we should have you on the ground in about 15 minutes. Marcus looked around the cabin at the passengers, business travelers typing on laptops, families with children, elderly couples holding hands, all of them trusting that the crew would get them safely to their destination, all of them depending on people like him, like the veterans he was training, like David Chen and Monica Rodriguez and hundreds of others who had chosen to dedicate their lives to bringing people home safely. As the landing gear extended and the aircraft lined up for approach, Marcus felt a deep sense of completion, not the end of something, but the beginning. He was going back to Phoenix to close one chapter of his life, and returned to Denver to continue writing the next one. The touchdown was smooth, and as they taxied to the gate, Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for the training facility. "Marcus, it's Robert Martinez. Sorry to call on your day off, but we just got approval for expanding the Wings Forward program. We're looking at training twice as many veterans next year, and we want to add a PTSD support component. Are you interested in heading that up?" Marcus looked out the window at the Phoenix airport, then thought about the flight back to Denver tomorrow, about the veterans who would be starting the program next week, about David Chen beginning his career as a captain, about his nephew Jake who still wanted to learn to fly. "Yes," he said, and for the first time in years, the word carried no doubt, no fear, only certainty. "I'm very interested." As passengers began deplaning around him, Marcus remained seated for a moment longer, savoring the feeling of knowing exactly where he belonged and what he was meant to do. The mission had changed, but in all the ways that mattered, Colonel Marcus Steele Thompson was exactly who he'd always been. A pilot, a leader, and someone who helped other people find their way home. He gathered his carry-on bag, stood up, and walked confidently toward whatever came next, knowing that sometimes the most important flights happen not in the sky, but in the journey back to yourself.